The rain-slicked streets of Seattle gleamed under the neon glow. But for Ezra Monroe, the world was collapsing in a single text. It was just for fun, easy. I'm done. 3 years of stolen kisses, late-night confessions, and promises whispered in the dark. Gone in 9 words from Caleb Voss. Ezra's phone slipped from his trembling hand, clattering onto the counter of the tiny coffee shop where he worked, the buzz of customers fading into a hollow hum. He was 25, a barista with dreams bigger than his paycheck, his hazel eyes always searching for meaning in the chaos of the city. Caleb, 28, a charismatic graphic designer with a smirk that could unravel anyone, had been his everything, until now. Ezra had believed in them, in the way Caleb's laugh lit up a room, in the quiet moments when they'd lie on the roof of Ezra's apartment, mapping constellations in the smoggy sky. But Caleb's fun had been Ezra's forever, and the betrayal cut deeper than he could breathe. He stumbled through his shift, the scent of espresso grounding him as he forced smiles for customers. By closing time, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with mist. Ezra locked the shop and wandered toward Pike Place Market, where the crowds had thinned and the cobblestones glistened under streetlights. He needed to feel something other than this ache. That's when he saw him, Julian Navarro, 32, leaning against a lamppost, sketching the market's chaos with swift, precise strokes. Julian was nothing like Caleb. Where Caleb was all flash and charm, Julian was quiet intensity, his dark eyes sharp yet kind, his calloused hands hinting at a life of creation. He wore a worn leather jacket, his black hair slightly graying at the temples, and his presence felt like an anchor in the storm of Ezra's heart. Ezra didn't know it then, but Julian was the man who had built Caleb from nothing. His mentor, his guide, the one who'd taught him everything before Caleb walked away from him. 2. "Nice sketch," Ezra said, his voice shaky as he peered over Julian's shoulder. The drawing captured the market's pulse. Vendors packing up, a busker strumming a guitar, a couple laughing over steaming clams. Julian glanced up, his gaze steady. "Thanks. It's just a moment, you know? Trying to hold on to it." His voice was low, warm, like the crackle of a fireplace. They talked. Ezra didn't mean to spill his heart, but the words tumbled out. Caleb's text, the betrayal, the way love had turned into a bruise. Julian listened, not interrupting, his pencil still in hand. "Sounds like he didn't know what he had," Julian said finally, his eyes meeting Ezra's with a sincerity that made his chest tighten. "Some people don't. They chase the thrill and miss the real thing." Ezra laughed, bitter. "Yeah, well, I was the real thing, and now I'm just this." He gestured at himself, his apron still dusted with coffee grounds, his eyes red from holding back tears. Julian tilted his head, studying him. "You're more than someone's afterthought, Ezra. You're a story waiting to be told." It was a strange thing to say, but it landed like a spark. Julian offered to walk him home, and Ezra, too tired to say no, agreed. They wove through Seattle's streets, passing murals and dive bars, the city alive with its own heartbeat. Julian shared fragments of his life. He was an artist, a sculptor who worked with reclaimed materials, turning broken things into something beautiful. He ran a small studio in Capitol Hill where he mentored young creatives, people like Caleb, though he didn't mention him yet. By the time they reached Ezra's apartment, a cramped walk-up with peeling paint, Ezra felt lighter. Julian didn't push, didn't flirt, just handed Ezra a business card with his studio's address. "Come by sometime," he said. "You look like you could use a place to breathe." Ezra nodded, clutching the card like a lifeline. That night, alone in his bed, Ezra replayed Caleb's text, but Julian's words echoed louder. He didn't sleep. Instead, he Googled Julian Navarro. The search pulled up articles, gallery photos, and a story about a young artist named Caleb Voss. mentored by Julian, who'd risen fast and then vanished from the scene. Ezra's stomach twisted. Caleb had never mentioned Julian, not once. But the pieces fit. Julian had built Caleb's career, given him a start, and Caleb had walked away without a backward glance, just like he'd done to Ezra. The next morning, Ezra stood outside Julian's studio, a converted warehouse with ivy crawling up its brick walls. He didn't know why he was there, only that he needed to understand. The door was open, and inside, Julian was shaping a sculpture from twisted metal and driftwood, his hands steady and sure. "You came," Julian said, not looking up, but a small smile curved his lips. Ezra hesitated. "I looked you up. You knew Caleb." Julian's hands stilled, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I did." The air grew heavy, but Julian didn't flinch. "He was my student. Talented, reckless. Thought he could outrun his own heart." Ezra's throat tightened. "He outran mine." Julian set down his tools, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come in. Let's talk." Ezra stepped inside, the studio smelling of sawdust and paint, a world of creation that felt safe, alive. They sat on mismatched chairs, and Julian told him the story. How he'd found Caleb at 19, a kid with raw talent and no direction. How he'd poured years into teaching him, believing in him. How Caleb had left without a word, chasing fame, leaving Julian to rebuild. "I thought I failed him," Julian admitted, his voice raw. "But maybe he just wasn't ready to be more than what he was." Ezra saw the pain in Julian's eyes, a mirror to his own. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his hurt. They talked until the sun dipped low, and when Ezra left, he felt something shift. A spark of hope, fragile but real. Over the next week, Ezra kept coming back. The studio became his refuge, a place where he could sketch, laugh, and forget Caleb's shadow. Julian was patient, never pushing, but his presence was a quiet pull, like gravity. One evening, as they worked side by side on a sculpture, their hands brushed, and Ezra didn't pull away. Julian's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world was just them. Two people carrying scars, daring to hope again. Ezra's days began to orbit around Julian's studio. The coffee shop was still his reality. Grueling shifts, spilled lattes, and customers who barely saw him. But the hours with Julian were different. They were a lifeline, pulling him from the wreckage of Caleb's betrayal. At 25, Ezra was learning to see himself through Julian's eyes. Not as a heartbroken barista, but as someone capable of creating, of maturing. Julian, at 32, carried his own ghosts, but he never let them dim the warmth he offered Ezra. The studio was a haven of chaos and beauty. Canvases leaned against walls, half-finished sculptures loomed like silent giants, and the air hummed with possibility. Ezra started sketching again, something he hadn't done since college, when Caleb had mocked his doodles as a waste of time. Julian, though, saw every line Ezra drew as a piece of his soul. "You've got a voice in these," Julian said one afternoon, holding up a sketch of a fractured cityscape, its cracks filled with blooming flowers. "Don't hide it." Ezra blushed, unaccustomed to praise that felt so real. "I'm not like you. You make things whole." Julian shook his head, his dark eyes steady. "Whole doesn't mean perfect. It means honest." That word honest stuck with Ezra. Caleb had never been honest, not with his feelings, not with his intentions. But Julian was different. Every word, every glance, felt like truth. Their connection grew in quiet moments, sharing takeout on the studio floor, laughing over bad sci-fi movies, or working in companionable silence. One night, as rain battered the warehouse roof, Julian told Ezra about his past. He'd grown up in a small Texas town, the only son of Mexican immigrants, his queerness a secret he buried until he escaped to Seattle at 18. Art had saved him, given him a language when words failed. "I thought Caleb was like me," Julian said, his voice soft, hungry for something bigger. But he just wanted to be seen, not known. Ezra's heart ached, not just for Julian, but for the part of himself that still loved Caleb, despite everything. "I thought I knew him," Ezra admitted. "I thought he loved me." Julian reached out, his hand resting on Ezra's. "You loved who you thought he could be. That's not your fault." The touch lingered, electric, and Ezra's breath caught. He wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but fear held him back. What if this was just another mistake? The next day, Ezra found a letter tucked into his sketchbook. It was from Julian, written in his neat, deliberate hand. "Ezra, you're not someone's shadow. You're the light they didn't see. Don't let fear steal what you deserve." Ezra read it over and over, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. He wanted to believe it, but Caleb's words still echoed, just for fun. What if Julian was wrong? What if Ezra wasn't enough? That evening, the studio hosted an open mic night, a monthly event where Julian's students shared their work. Ezra hadn't planned to perform, but Julian nudged him to read a poem he'd written, a raw, jagged piece about love and loss. The crowd was small, a mix of artists and locals, but Ezra's voice shook as he stood under the dim lights. "I gave you my stars," he read, "and you burned them to ash." The room was silent, then erupted in applause. Julian's eyes shone with pride, and for the first time, Ezra felt seen. Afterward, they walked to a nearby pier, the Puget Sound glittering under the moon. Julian stopped, turning to Ezra. "You were incredible tonight. You know that, right?" Ezra shrugged, his cheeks warm. "I was terrified." Julian stepped closer, his voice low. "That's what makes it real." Their eyes locked, and Ezra felt the pull again, stronger now. He wanted to kiss Julian, to let go of the fear, but his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. It was a text from Caleb. "Miss you, Izzy. Can we talk?" Ezra's heart lurched. He showed Julian the screen, expecting jealousy or anger, but Julian just sighed. "He's not done hurting you, is he?" Ezra didn't answer, but the question lingered as they walked back in silence. Caleb's return was a storm cloud on the horizon, threatening the fragile peace Ezra had found. The next morning, Ezra woke to another text from Caleb. "I messed up. Let's meet." Against his better judgment, Ezra agreed. They met at a diner in Belltown, where Caleb sat, all charm and apologies, his green eyes glinting like they always had. "I was scared," Caleb said, reaching for Ezra's hand. "But I love you. I want us back." Ezra wanted to believe him, but Julian's words echoed, honest. Caleb's love had never been honest. He left the diner, his heart a tangle of hope and doubt. When he reached the studio, Julian was there working on a new sculpture, a figure rising from broken glass. "You saw him," Julian said, not a question. Ezra nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "He says he loves me." Julian's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed soft. "And what do you say?" Ezra didn't know. All he knew was that Julian's presence felt like home, and Caleb's felt like a trap. Ezra stood in the studio, the weight of Caleb's words pressing against the fragile hope he'd built with Julian. At 25, he was caught between the past he'd loved and the future he was beginning to imagine. Julian, 32, stood before him, his hands dusted with clay, his dark eyes searching Ezra's face for an answer. The sculpture between them, a figure emerging from shattered glass, felt like a metaphor for Ezra's heart, broken but reaching for something new. "I don't know what I want," Ezra admitted, his voice cracking. "Caleb says he's changed," but Julian nodded, setting down his tools. "He's good at saying what you want to hear. Always was." There was no bitterness in Julian's tone, just a quiet resignation that made Ezra's chest ache. He wanted to reach out, to tell Julian he was different, but Caleb's pull was a ghost he couldn't shake. Over the next few days, Caleb was relentless. Texts, calls, even showing up at the coffee shop with flowers and that disarming smile. "I was an idiot," Caleb said one afternoon, leaning across the counter as Ezra steamed milk. "I didn't know what I had." At 28, Caleb was still magnetic, his blonde hair catching the light, his confidence unshaken. But Ezra saw the cracks now, the way Caleb's apologies never quite reached his eyes, the way his promises felt rehearsed. Julian, meanwhile, gave Ezra space. He didn't push, didn't demand answers, but his absence felt louder than Caleb's presence. Ezra missed the studio, the smell of paint, the way Julian's laugh could unravel his worst days. One evening, desperate for clarity, Ezra returned to the warehouse. Julian was alone, welding a new piece, sparks flying like tiny stars. He looked up, his face softening. "Thought you might be with him," Julian said, setting down his torch. "I was," Ezra confessed, "but I'm here now." They sat on the studio's rooftop, the city sprawling below, its lights blurring in the mist. Ezra told Julian everything. Caleb's apologies, his own confusion, the fear of being hurt again. Julian listened, his silence a gift. When Ezra finished, Julian spoke softly. "You deserve someone who sees you, Ezra, not someone who needs you to fix them." The words hit hard. Ezra thought of Caleb's charm, his fleeting moments of tenderness, and how they'd always come with a price. Then he thought of Julian, steady, honest, a man who built beauty from broken things. "What if I choose wrong?" Ezra whispered. Julian's hand found his, warm and sure. "You won't. Trust yourself." The touch was a promise, and Ezra's heart raced. He leaned in, their lips brushing in a kiss that felt like coming home. But the next day, Caleb upped the stakes. He invited Ezra to an art gallery opening in Pioneer Square, where Caleb's new work was being showcased. "I want you there," Caleb said, his voice earnest. "It's for you." Against his better judgment, Ezra went. The gallery was packed, the air thick with wine and pretension. Caleb's paintings were bold, chaotic, but Ezra saw the truth. They were hollow, all flash and no depth. Caleb pulled him aside, his hand lingering on Ezra's arm. "I painted these for us," he said. "Give me another chance." Ezra's heart wavered, but then he saw Julian across the room. He hadn't expected him, but there he was, talking to a curator, his presence grounding. Julian's eyes met Ezra's, and in that moment Ezra knew. Caleb's love was a performance, a spark that burned out fast. Julian's was a fire that warmed without consuming. He left Caleb at the gallery, his apologies fading into the crowd. Outside, Julian was waiting, leaning against a brick wall. "You okay?" Julian asked. Ezra nodded, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm choosing me. And you." Julian's smile was small, but it lit up the night. They walked together, the city alive around them, and Ezra felt free. Ezra's choice wasn't a clean break. Caleb didn't vanish quietly. At 28, he was too stubborn, too used to getting what he wanted. The texts kept coming, each one sharper, more desperate. "You're throwing us away for him?" Ezra ignored them, but each ping was a needle in his resolve. At 25, he was learning that love wasn't just about choosing. It was about holding firm when the past clawed back. Julian, 32, was a constant in the storm. Their relationship deepened in the studio's quiet moments, where they sculpted, sketched, and shared pieces of themselves. One afternoon, as they worked on a joint project, a mosaic of reclaimed glass and metal, Julian told Ezra about his first love, a boy from his Texas hometown who'd broken his heart. "I thought I'd never trust again," Julian said, his hand steady as he placed a shard of blue glass. But then you showed up. Ezra's chest warmed, and he realized he was falling, not just for Julian, but for the person he was becoming with him. But Caleb wasn't done. One night, he showed up at Ezra's apartment, drunk and reckless. "You think Julian's your savior?" Caleb slurred, his eyes wild. "He's just using you to get back at me." Ezra's stomach churned, doubt creeping in. Caleb had always known how to twist the knife. "You don't know him," Ezra said, shutting the door, but Caleb's words lingered like poison. The next day, Ezra confronted Julian. They sat in the studio, the air thick with tension. "Did you know I was with Caleb when we met?" Ezra asked, his voice tight. Julian nodded, his expression calm but pained. "I suspected, but I didn't want to be your rebound, Ezra. I wanted you to choose me for you, not to spite him." The honesty disarmed Ezra, and he felt the doubt dissolve. Julian wasn't Caleb. He wasn't playing games. Their bond grew stronger, but the world wasn't always kind. At a local art fair where Julian displayed his work, whispers followed them. "Isn't that Caleb's ex?" someone muttered, eyeing Ezra. "And his mentor?" The judgment stung, but Julian held Ezra's hand, unflinching. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know us." Ezra squeezed his hand, grateful for his strength. One evening, as they walked through Fremont, Ezra spotted a mural, a vibrant burst of color depicting two men embracing under a starry sky. It was unsigned, but Ezra knew Caleb's style. It felt like a taunt, a reminder of what he'd lost. Julian saw it too, his jaw tight. "He's trying to get in your head," Julian said. "Don't let him." Ezra nodded, but the mural haunted him, a ghost of his past love. The breaking point came at a community art event. Caleb crashed it, his presence a storm. He cornered Ezra, his voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this. Julian's nothing without me." Ezra's anger flared. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "You're the one who's nothing without him." Caleb's face twisted, but before he could respond, Julian appeared, his calm presence a shield. "Leave, Caleb," Julian said, his tone final. Caleb stormed off, and Ezra felt a weight lift. That night, Ezra and Julian sat on the studio's rooftop, the city glittering below. "I'm sorry," Ezra said, his voice soft, "for letting him get to me." Julian shook his head, pulling Ezra close. "You're human, and you're mine." The words were a balm, and Ezra kissed him, the world fading away. For the first time, he believed in a future that wasn't haunted by Caleb. Ezra's life with Julian became a rhythm of love and creation. At 25, he was no longer the barista defined by heartbreak. He was an artist, a partner, a man learning to trust his own heart. Julian, 32, was his anchor, his muse, the one who saw him when he couldn't see himself. The studio was their sanctuary, where they built not just art, but a life together. Caleb's shadow faded, though not without a final jab. A month after the art event, Ezra received an email from an unknown address, a link to a blog post titled "The Mentor and the Muse, a Seattle Scandal." It was Caleb's work, a venomous piece accusing Julian of stealing his talent and Ezra of being a pawn. The post spread online, and whispers grew louder at art events. Ezra's heart sank, but Julian was unshaken. "Let him scream," Julian said, his voice calm. "The truth doesn't need to shout." They decided to fight back with their art. Julian proposed a joint exhibition, a showcase of their work, sculptures, sketches, and mosaics that told their story. Ezra was nervous, but Julian's belief in him was unshakable. "This is us," Julian said, gesturing to their pieces. "This is what we've built." The exhibition, held in a small Capitol Hill gallery, was a risk, but Ezra poured his heart into it, creating a series of sketches about love, loss, and rebirth. The night of the opening, the gallery was packed. Friends, artists, and strangers filled the space, their voices mingling with soft music. Ezra's sketches drew gasps, raw, emotional lines that captured his journey from Caleb's betrayal to Julian's love. Julian's sculptures, towering and intricate, stood as testaments to resilience. At the center was their joint piece, a mosaic of glass and metal, a figure rising from chaos, its heart a burst of color. A small plaque beside it read, "For Ezra, my light." The crowd loved it, but Ezra's eyes were on Julian, who stood across the room, his smile quiet but radiant. A critic approached Ezra, praising his work, but Ezra barely heard her. He crossed the gallery, pulling Julian into a kiss that silenced the room. Applause broke out, and Ezra laughed, his heart full. Caleb's lies didn't matter. The truth was in their art, in their love. After the exhibition, life settled into a new normal. Ezra quit the coffee shop, taking a part-time job at an art supply store while he worked on his portfolio. Julian's studio became a hub for young queer artists, a safe space where they could create without fear. Ezra mentored a few, finding joy in helping others find their voice, just as Julian had helped him. One evening, as they sat on their favorite bench in a Seattle park, the same one from their first real moment, Ezra turned to Julian. "You built me from nothing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Julian shook his head, his hand finding Ezra's. "You were never nothing. You just needed someone to see it." They kissed under the autumn leaves, the city humming around them, and Ezra knew this was the love he'd always wanted, real, honest, unbreakable. Years later, Ezra would look back on that moment as the start of everything. Caleb's fun had been a fleeting spark, but Julian's love was a fire that never burned out. Together, they built a life of art, love, and meaning, proving that from nothing, something beautiful could rise.